Hi, my name is Maverick Evans, and today for the Fall Book Club, we're going to be taking a look at The Faithful Executioner, Life and Death, Honor and Shame in the Turbulent 16th Century by Joel F. Harrington, or Joel, I don't know. I think it's Joel. So this is a really awesome history book that I had seen someone talk about on social media somewhere, recommending it, and I just wanted to give it a look because it had a really cool cover and the subject matter is awesome. It's about an executioner in the 16th century, which is like something that is super cool and weirdly not very well scholarly researched. I feel like there's a lot of representations in modern media and all kinds of different, movies and stories about these medieval executioners, but not a whole lot of actual historical representation of what they might be like. And for the most part, when people think of a medieval executioner, they of course always have this image in their head of this hulking, 7-foot tall man with a black hood over his head that is carrying an axe or something of that sort. And that's just not it at all. The fact of the matter is that hooded executions, so the attempt to keep the executioner anonymous, was fairly rare. It didn't occur very often, and it would have had to have very specific circumstances in order for whoever was ordering the execution to believe that that was necessary. But for the most part, all executioners were barefaced. They didn't hide their identity whatsoever. And more than that, almost everybody knew who the executioner of that particular town or city was. And so that's kind of where the content of this book picks up. There are a couple of main themes or things that are wrestled with in this book and with the subject of the book. Meister, or Meister? I think it's Meister Franz Schmidt. Meister is like he's like the Game of Thrones doctors. But so Meister Franz Schmidt is the subject of the entire book, and the majority of this material is actually taken from his journals that were written over a very long course of time. Meister Schmidt has one of the most detailed autobiographical histories of any executioner, and really one of the most extensive first-hand historical documents that we have. It's like a very convenient piece of information that was found. And if I recall correctly, the person who wrote this, Joel F. Harrington, there had been a few publications on Meister Schmidt's work, but not like a ton of attention had been given to it just yet. And so when Harrington found it, he was in Germany somewhere in like this really old bookstore and happened upon a very early version of Schmidt's writings. And so when he found it, he was like, wow, this is an amazing utility. I need to use it and turn it into something that's more digestible for people of today. And so that's what he did, and it was amazing. So I'll give you a rundown on kind of like the preface for who Meister Franz Schmidt is. He was an executioner who had one of the longest and most prominent careers among his contemporaries. He was a full-time executioner in Nuremberg and began his career at the age of 19 and retired at 64. He kept extremely detailed journals that recorded and depicted 45 years of killings and tortures. He killed over 330 people and tortured several hundred, though many of those tortures were forgot and lost to time. He has an extremely extensive career, and he died at about the age of 80. So he had a very long life in comparison to most people who lived through what a lot of people refer to as the long 16th century, which was between about 1480 to 1620. And that's mostly because the circumstances during that time were very harsh. There were very many deaths. Death was a very common thing. For example, I think it was that Franz's mother died when he was about 7 years of age, and the likelihood of him surviving during that time of his birth was like 50-50 at least. And so, or at most rather. And so most children died before the age of 12, and that's where the 50-50 chance comes from. So survival rates were really low, and if you took a look at infant mortality, that would have been even higher. And so death was just all around everybody, and it was a really difficult time. And so that's kind of why I think that they refer to from the period between 1480 about and 1620 about as the long 16th century. That's kind of the characteristics that Franz Schmidt lives in. This is what he has been born into. And it wasn't so hard at the beginning for them, because one of the big things in cultural contexts are a really big deal for when we talk about this book, because honor and respect and right living are one of the most important things to the people of this time. And so it was extremely important that you lived a life that would honor your family, honor yourself, honor the royals that were above you. They were well revered just because they were royal, which is like a very odd thing to consider, because in today's world it's much different. Obviously we don't have oligarchies running us, but the royals at that time were thought of as morally righteous, morally good, because of their stature in the class systems. And so, which is like a weird thing for us, because we hate Donald Trump and Biden and everybody because they're above us and everything, and maybe their responsibility with the country wasn't well earned or isn't well put to use or governed. And so, but at this time, a king is not only the person who determines laws and maintains justice, but also the person who is the icon for moral ideal. And so, which is something that's kind of weird for us to think about, since in America we have things kind of extrapolated out, where we have our president is responsible for maybe the justice, but then we don't really have a moral kind of thing. That you can see that in England still, where the royalty there are still a moral, virtuous family that is looked up to by the people that they govern. So that being said, it would be very important to try and have some kind of occupation as a man of the time that would reflect the family well and create a good start for your descendants, your ancestors that you'll generate. And so, Heinrich Schmidt, he was a woodcutter, and this was the father of Franz Schmidt. And that's a pretty respectable job. It was honest work, it was hard labor, and being a woodcutter was very respectable. And so that was a very good setup for them for a little while, especially when Franz was in his teenage years and in his childhood. But I'll look here, and I'm gonna mess up this name. But there was a lord named Albrecht Alcibiades of Brandenburg-Kulmbach, and this lord came into the town of Hof, which is where Heinrich Schmidt lived with his family as a woodcutter. And so this lord had just come in. He had occupied the town. He was the new occupant and ruler of Hof, and there were a couple of gunsmiths, I believe, that were accused of or found guilty, which, with the justice system back then, who knows whether they were guilty or not. But they were charged with conspiracy against the Lord's life. They were going to try and assassinate him, and they were found out somehow, and they were sentenced to death, right? So they're going to be killed. But at that time, the new occupying lord didn't have the funds nor the people necessary to employ a full-time executioner. So for smaller towns or whatnot, they may not have the opportunity to employ an executioner full time. And surely there was no one volunteering for this job, because in the culture of that day, an executioner was a very filthy, dirty, despicable, and unrespectable, uncleanly job. And so if you were an executioner, then you would have a hard time being able to attend mass. You would have had a hard time going into bars or restaurants or whatever you wanted to, and visiting with other people. People wouldn't even come into your home because you were thought to be uncleanly and unclean and defiled in many ways that maybe they didn't even understand, because it was like dirty, like, like we think of like grime and grit, but then also like unholy, so, and immoral, which is kind of like a difficult thing, because in this time the executioner seemed to be kind of a necessity. If they were going to be putting people to death, then they needed an executioner. But at the same time, they're gonna turn around and say, "Oh well, we can't even associate you, and you're kind of going to be estranged from society and from all of the town and the city because of what you do. So we need you, but we're also going to just like completely shun you and ostracize you." So that's rough. But this lord came in, and he didn't have any executioner to kill the gunsmiths, and so it just so happened that Heinrich Schmidt happened to be somewhere near him, within sight. And so the Lord turned to Heinrich and invoked, I suppose, a very old tradition that existed at that time, and basically the tradition was that if there were no executioner employed and or available, then you could invoke a bystander to fill that role. And so he said, "Heinrich, you will conduct this execution." And that is terrible. A terrible twist of fate for this family, because he was now being forced to do something that would defile his family name and create an ancestry that will always be tainted. And this too, I'll have to say, is like an official thing. If you would have been marked and filed down in the court systems as an executioner, and that would have always followed you everywhere that you went with your papers and your identification. And so you were officially defiled, officially uncleanly, officially dishonorable, right? And so that was just terrible. And so Heinrich had to do it, and that was what he ended up having to do. He conducted the executioners, and then from then on, he was no longer a woodcutter. He was an executioner. And granted, I think that, and I'm not sure if the book mentions this or not, or if I'm just drawing this parallel, but it seems fairly convenient that he would choose a woodcutter as the executioner, because he's fluent with an axe, and so maybe he'll be able, if he can chop wood, he can chop heads off, I guess was the logic there, or may have been. And so from then on, he had to carry out the rest of his career as an executioner, because there was no going back. He couldn't continue as a woodcutter because people wouldn't purchase from him. And so he was kind of stuck and pigeonholed in this career as a headsman. And so with that, there was no option then for Franz Schmidt, his son, to do anything but execution as well. And when he took up the mantle at about 19 years of age, he did a fairly good job of it. He only had one or two mishaps occurred during his whole time, and those were terrible. If you messed up, if you botched a beheading, especially if it took more than one swing to behead the person, then the crowds were likely, because there would be massive crowds that would gather around for these executions. They wanted to see it, and that was an important part of the justice system at that time, was for the people to see the punishment be carried out. if you botched it up, then they would have likely like mobbed and rioted and like tried to kill you. And I think that was a fairly common occurrence as well, that if you were a fairly disliked or incompetent executioner and you botched one too many or just one execution, usually beheadings, although they were more difficult and strenuous and complicated ways of executing or torture / execution that you could have botched up, but they would have, I mean, they killed the executioners sometimes. The crowd would. They would just like bludgeon them to death or throw rocks at them or something like that, and then, you know, they would have killed them because they messed up the ceremony. They messed up the ritual and the carrying out of justice. It was wrong. And so really harsh times, honestly. Like, all of this is super, super rough. And that's not even to get into the different forms of execution. I know that for women, a lot of times they preferred not to hang them. And I think the reason for not hanging women was so that you couldn't see up their dress. That would have been immodest for a woman being strangled to death. And so instead they would put them in like these hemp sacks, like these potato sacks, basically, tie them up and then throw them off of a dock, and then kill them that way, which is just so ludicrous to think about. That is such a barbaric way to put someone to death is to, you know, drown them in a sack in the lake. I think there was one occurrence in the book where a woman had been sentenced to death for maybe supposed witchcraft or something like that, or maybe I don't know what she had done, but she was put to death. They put her in the sack, they threw her in the lake, and then somehow she miraculously was able to hold her breath and escape the bag, and then she swam all the way back to the dock and then stood there in defiance, dripping wet. And I think she had stated something that they would have to try harder next time. So she very effectively insulted them, and then of course they put her in another bag, and then they made sure that she drowned. They held her down with a stick or something. So that was probably one of the most lighthearted parts of the entire book, and that was not very light. It's very dark still. So it's a very dark book. I mean, it's about nothing but death. So, you know, one of the things that I struggled with for a long time, and this really began whenever I read some Fyodor Dostoevsky. And so I read Crime and Punishment, and I read The House of the Dead. And those two books single-handedly completely scrambled my brain on what I believed, and my soul really, on what I believed about the death penalty, about capital punishment. And so previously, when I was much younger, I was all for the death penalty, and then I thought there should be an express lane for that. You kill somebody, you get killed. And then, those books really opened my eyes to the opportunity of individual redemption, for atonement with God after, terrible mortal sins. And, the opportunity for someone to turn a new leaf, to become a new person, to undergo death and resurrection as Christ had, and to, redeem themselves for the rest of their life. And so I just didn't know what to believe on that. I had a discussion recently with a clergyman, and he kind of helped me see through this whole death penalty issue a little clearer through, the Christian lens, through a biblical and scriptural lens, and that, the Romans 13 basically says that the government that has been ordained by God, has been put in place by God, is in possession of the power of the sword, and that if they were to neglect to exercise the power of the sword, that would be a neglect to enact justice on the part of God himself. And so I can't really argue with that, and there's a lot of different scriptural interpretations of what that and other related scriptures may mean, or what their implications might be for, government punishments. But it seems pretty straightforward, and so now I'm like kind of on the fence. I feel like it's biblically supported, but it's still, an issue of great magnitude that should be addressed and approached with the utmost care and attention. These are human lives that we're dealing with. So when we go through, the justice system, that there should be, due process, speedy trials, and we should make sure that we're doing our very most to determine the innocence or the guilt of a person who may suffer the death penalty. And so, how then? Because what about Meister Schmidt? Well, he was a practicing Christian, weird enough. And so, how does he reconcile this occupation of literally, beheading people and torturing people? And basically, I think that this was also in one of the scriptures too. First or Second Peter chapter 13, that basically just says that Christians are to submit to the human authorities, right? Human governances, and that so long as they don't instruct something that is antithetical to the law, the divine law, then it should be submitted to, should be carried out. And so that's pretty much what Franz Schmidt thought, was that this was something that maybe he wouldn't ever want to do. Of course, it was not something that he would have chose for himself or for his family or for his father, but that it was something that the governing forces of the land were putting to him, and that it was his duty to honor those powers, those governances, and to carry it out as he believed God instructed him to do. And so that's pretty much how he rationalizes it. And he also believes that there are opportunities for repentance and salvation, even moments before the executions. There were oftentimes priests who would come to visit the people who were set to be executed, and if not the priests, then I think that, if I remember correctly, that Schmidt himself would offer, last rites to some of the people that he was commuting to be executed. And in several cases, there were people who Franz Schmidt had executed, and they were completely vehement, unrepentant, and cursing and spitting in all directions, cursing God and everyone else. But then there were other people who surprisingly had committed grievous acts and were, according to Franz Schmidt, which I feel like he may have a good gauge for this, because he sees them. 330 people he's killed in his life, so he maybe have a good experience with whether or not people are genuinely repenting or not. Because he said that some people would just say it because they felt that's what they needed. But there were a few people that he executed that on their way to, say, the gallows or the sword or whatever way it was that they were deciding to execute him, that he would cry out, and they would cry out one of the Psalms about, being repentant and everything, and that it was a genuine thing that they had cried out to God, and that he truly believed that in that moment that person had truly repented and received salvation from God. And so that was another way that Meister Franz Schmidt justified or rationalized his occupation, and how he reconciled his place as an executioner with his place as a practicing Christian. And so that was like one of the things that really kind of helped me get into at least a more nuanced or a more defined position in concerning to as far as the death penalty is concerned. And so, yeah, this is an incredible book. So if you are on the edge with the death penalty, or you just want to know more about it, or you want to know what it was like back in the day when people had to be put to death, the the people of the time in the long 16th century felt incredibly unsafe. There was, bandits and highwaymen. I think they were referred to, the German word for is Landsknecht, which they were described as a new order of soulless people who have no respect for honor or justice and practice whoring, adultery, rape, gluttony, drunkenness, stealing, robbing, and murder, who live entirely in the power of the devil, who pulls them about whenever he wants. Those were the people that were roaming the earth at that time, and there was very little policing going on. And so people were just coming under, the power of the Landsknecht and, being torn apart. And there was a strong need and desire in the civil people to receive justice and vengeance even for some of the terrible things that these evil people would act upon, the rightly civilians of any town or city. And so the one way that the crowns would be able to instill that feeling of safety and security was to express to the people, if you commit these acts, then you will be put to death. And it was not as easy to achieve the death penalty as people might think. Obviously much easier than it might be today, but more difficult than you might think it was. And so, for instance, there was a young boy who was maybe 14, and he had taken to thieving, and he had stolen 3 times. And they had worked with him to try and rehabilitate him, to try and get him to act properly. And they had put him in shackles for a little while each time. But then on the 3rd time, and the judge or whatever had told him, if you come in here again with the same charge, I'm going to have to put you to death. So this is your opportunity. If you do it again, we're going to put you to death. We don't want to do that, but I'm going to have to. You're going to force me. And then he did it again. And that was one of the youngest, I believe, that Franz Schmidt had ever executed, was a 14-year-old boy. And it seems in his writings that it was something that was difficult for him to carry out. And that was one thing too. But this is getting kind of long, so I'll kind of wrap it up again. But Franz Schmidt, an interesting thing about him was that he was not introspective whatsoever, really. We don't know, we can only glean small fractional hints about the way that he felt, about the things that he was doing. For example, the fact that he only spoke the words I and my 15 times in his accounts, and he only spoke the word me once. So only wrote those words collectively 16 times. And so that's an amazing feat, first of all, for a kind of autobiographical account of one's career, to only use those words so few. And so we don't know how he felt necessarily. But what we do know is that he was passionate about justice and about serving Christ, and that he was able to reconcile those two things, and that there was something to it, I think, that was true, I think. That something that can be reconciled. I don't think it's impossible, which I feel is a very unpopular opinion. But yeah, so I'm still a little confused on the subject, but if I had to say where I land, I would say that I was in favor of the death penalty. Who am I to suggest that we should disavow capital punishment? I don't have a solution to it. I don't have an alternative. I do think that if we're making a modern commentary on the state of things, that the prisons are terrible, that recidivism rates in America are unacceptable, and that there may be other prison systems in other countries that work a little better. But as far as death penalties go, if some act of evil occurs, such as a box truck running in killing 70 people, I think that it would be it would be unjust to sentence that man to 21 years in prison and not to death. So that was The Faithful Executioner by Joel F. Harrington, and it was really good. There's so much more that I could have talked about this book, and I just don't have the time. Like, the content is huge, and there's so much to it. And if you want to know about the long 16th century and about the executioners and about how life was then, this is an amazing book to give you more insight on those topics. So, yeah, that's it. If you made it all this way, because this is a longer video, congrats. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you later.